put it there. Right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all for inviting me. And it's just lovely to be amongst friends again. It's a long time, I think, since I've met so many of you all in one place. And it's a real pleasure to see so many that I know. So these are the questions that I'd like to talk about over the period of the next half hour. These are very much the same questions that Stuart mentioned earlier. When open field systems were introduced, who introduced them, and why their structure is significant for the answers. So that's roughly where we're going over the course of the next half hour. So this is the plan for where I intend to go. So it's a brief introduction, something about tradition, something about innovation, and a conclusion. A beginning, a middle, and an end. By way of introduction, there are three things I'd like to say. I'd like to say something about the ways that we think about change. I'd like to say something about definitions of open fields. And I'd like to say something about how we differentiate between different types of open field. So there are two ways of thinking about the past. Actually, there are lots of ways of thinking about the past, but the two that I want to talk about today. One is that of cause and effect. Cause and effect is a very blunt instrument. It basically goes like this. Once upon a time, there were prehistoric and Romano-British farmers farming prehistoric and Romano-British fields. And then one of a number of things happened, could be any one of those things, take your pick, and lo and behold, the Midland open field system and settlement nucleation were simultaneously introduced. Now, I don't intend to talk about any of those things, but if you'd like to ask me about why I don't want to talk about them now, I'll happily talk to you about them afterwards. This is a way that I'd prefer to talk about the past. So it's looking at the past in terms of a complex system. So this diagram shows, shows up here. This is long time that moves, things that move so slowly and imperceptibly that you don't see them happening within the course of a single lifetime. But if you could live for 200 or 300 years, you would then definitely see a change from one period to another. So, for example, with field systems, you might be looking at traditional ways of managing fields collectively, for example. Down here at the bottom are things that happen quickly, events, cataclysmic events, not cataclysmic events, but for example, floods, tsunamis, plagues, a particular actor, Genghis Khan comes to mind. You know, that sort of, somebody that reacts, that causes a ripple in society. And then in the middle, that is change that occurs over the period of a person's lifetime. So it's long-term change, medium-term change, and short-term change. And you can see them here. So now the system works like this. This is a diagram by a really interesting man called C.S. Holling. He says that this is where change occurs in the medium term. Sometimes a big event happens, there's a catalyst, an event, a disaster, and it causes a ripple in the way that things are normally happen. And that in turn causes change throughout society. However, the possibility of imbalance, of just destroying one's society altogether, is inhibited by traditions which people remember over long periods of time, which put a brake on how serious those changes can be. It doesn't mean that you'll avoid disaster. Sometimes the system will just disintegrate, but at other times you manage to be able to carry on, but you can see the change happening and being influenced by it. And that's a much more, you're talking here about process in the medium term rather than events, and how process can be stimulated by short-term events and inhibited, or its dangerous aspects inhibited by long-term traditions. And that's how I want to approach open fields. So definitions of open fields. We don't often see a definition, and I think they're important. It's a field that's shared between two or more cultivators in such a way that you can walk from one holding to another without impedance. And that's really quite an important, that is an important conceptual practicality. How do you manage something like that in practice? In practice, each person who has a share in that field has a right of property which is defensible in law. And that right of property is intended to protect him or her, or probably him, from damage to his crops, from lack of access, all those things. So what that means is you get rights restricted to a particular group, don't have everybody with rights in common fields, open fields. They're defensible in law. They're collectively governed. Everybody within the field has a right to say how the field should be managed, because otherwise it would become a dictatorship and one person's rights would be abrogated. So it has to be collectively governed by people with equal status within the system, even if their actual social status varied. And Stuart had a very nice example of that. Sorry, Stuart, I shouldn't point. Had a very nice example of that earlier on. And then these systems have the possibility of persisting over very long periods of time because they're not dependent on one person's lifetime. When one shareholder dies or leaves, his place can be taken somewhere else by someone else and the system continues to operate. So the thing about these patterns of rights is that they are exactly the same as those that govern common rights of pasture. And common rights of pasture are used to establish rights in a territory, rights to the governance of a territory, rights of status, because your status to participate in a territory is important. So all kinds of other rights and aspects of status are associated with these forms of shared rights, and perfectly described by Ros Book in her terrific book, on lordship and the Anglo-Saxon peasantry. I just realized that my very first slide was a picture of Chris and David. So I shall talk about them at the end. Well, now, what about differentiating between open fields? This is one of the images from Stuart and Brian Roberts' wonderful atlas, and it shows the central province running down the middle of the country from northeast down to southwest. And then, but you can see that open fields extend beyond the central province. And the trouble with the coloration of this is that it doesn't show the intensity of open fields from one place to another. It simply shows different authorships. They completely have to disregard the intensity and just look at the fact that there's open fields all over England, but not all of them are Midland extensive open fields, what people commonly call medieval open fields. That's what they think of. So now Mark Bailey wrote an absolutely wonderful article in 2010, which was published in Agricultural History Review, where he reminded us of the distinction between the two different forms of open field. On the one hand, there were what he calls narrow open field systems. And these are the traditional forms of open field that one finds both inside, but importantly, also beyond the central province. Here, there are plenty of, the arable is divided into lots of small fields. Tenure is partial. It can be in just one part of the field. It can be anywhere. Each strip, each holding is cultivated in severalty, but people farm their own strips. This isn't a collective agriculture. This is where the commonality is restricted to a very narrow set of parameters, which is why Mark called them narrow, so that they are to maintain the boundary, so that nobody suffers. Everybody must help to maintain the boundary. And then you must have rights of access, and you must have the right to redress if there's some damage to your crops. And that's basically all you've got. The important thing about these fields, as I say, is that they're found right the way across Britain, and we'll come back to that in a while. Then Mark described what he called wide open field systems, and these are the familiar fields of the Midland system. So here, all the arable of the Ville, divided into 3 fields. Tenure is scattered equitably between those 3 fields. There's crop rotation from one field to the next to the third over a period. The rotation itself varies from place to place, but it's very often a wheat crop, a barley crop, and then a fallow field, and it shifts around. The important thing about this kind of field from the point of view of rights is that you've got to maintain the boundary collectively. You still have to have rights of access. You still have to have redress against damage. But there is also the right to fallow, to crop to pasture your animals on the fallow field, and sometimes on the stubbles of the arable fields once they've been harvested. So we're talking here about legal rights, a wider set of legal rights and a narrower set of legal rights. And those wider rights are only found in the central province. And they are the indicators of the Midland system. Right. Traditional fields. This is what commonly a traditional field looks like, one with narrow rights over the field. This is Atkins' well-known example from Tunley in Lancashire. There's an infield, which is all arable. It's an open field, but the different colours distinguish between different holders. You can walk from one person's holding to another, but each holding is cultivated by the holder himself. There's no common crop. There's no let's get together and only have wheat this year. It's I'll do this with mine and you can do that with yours. And if I choose to put my animals on my strips or my enclosures, not enclosures, on my holdings at the end of the harvest, I have to tether them in such a way that they don't damage your holding. And then below is the outfield, which is pasture. So that's a narrow open field. Here's another one. They take such a huge variety of shapes and forms. There's another one from Suffolk. Here's the shared open field where they do operate it in people still cultivating their own strips, still managing in severalty, but they have the common boundary around it, the rights of access and damage. And then they also have quite a lot of land that they farm, each person farms in severalty. So how old are these systems? Stewart referred to Ina's law. Now the great thing about Ina's law from this point of view is that it was late 7th century and it describes an open field. Harold Fox got a terrifically convincing analysis of this element in Ina's laws, and he's conclusively shown that you're looking at an open field. It's shared between a number of owners. You can clearly walk from one holding to another because otherwise the cattle wouldn't just, if the cattle came through the fence, they wouldn't do damage to anybody's crops. It might just be one person's crops. They have a right of access to it and they have a right to redress against damage. So we can say that narrow open fields, we can't say this is a wide open field because there is no evidence for it. We have to go for a narrow open field. The narrow open fields are at least 7th century. But we start looking at the archaeology. This is Stephen Upex's diagram of an excavation that he did at Haddon in Northamptonshire. These black things, these are Romano-British and then early medieval settlements. 4th, 5th, 6th century settlements. And they're set inside a field system, which Stephen says was collectively farmed. So it's a shared field system. If it's a shared field system, it must have a boundary to keep the animals out, you must have rights of access, and you must have redress against damage. It's a narrow open field system. There's another one. This is High No on the borders. That's Piers Dixon walking across. There's a lovely photograph from Mike Middleton. This is an Iron Age field system. It's divided into fields. Each field is divided into strips, and Dixon and his co-authors are convinced that this was collectively cultivated. So if we're looking at narrow open field systems, there's a lot of evidence, much more than I can show you today, to suggest that it goes right the way back into prehistory. So you've got a continuous tradition of collective cultivation. I'm not saying everybody put all their arable into these fields. I'm saying that there is evidence for them alongside fields farmed in severalty, holdings farmed in. So from the point of view of tradition, we have a long tradition of collective cultivation across at least 3 millennia, or 2 millennia, say if you go up to the Norman conquest. What about innovation? Let's look at medium-term change. How did that change to create the conditions from which the Midland system may have evolved? The extensive estates. The extensive estates were granted from the mid-6th, mid-7th, until the mid-9th century. Huge estates. After that, estates granting becomes smaller. The estates granted become smaller, and they're granted to an elite who are either members of the royal family or very closely connected to them. Right, so that's one thing that happens. There's a process of change of ownership from what I've called the long 8th century, from about 650 to 850. Many of those estates were granted to minsters, and that's where it gets really interesting, because minsters had to make a profit on their estates. They weren't peripatetic. You couldn't, once you'd used up all the resources on one part of your estate, move somewhere else, as the secular elite could do. You were located in one place, you had to make a surplus. So what did they want the money for? They wanted it to make amazing churches. They wanted to decorate their churches. They wanted to make their churches look like Roman churches, which involved getting workmen from Europe. They wanted luxury goods. They wanted kestrels for hunting from Brandon. They wanted fine glass and ornaments like these brooches that we found on that woman recently in Northamptonshire. And they wanted to be able to create a surplus with which they could trade and then make capital for investment back into the estate to improve production, because the only way they were going to make money in the long run was by extending arable production. And you have to remember that the agricultural revolution was the agricultural revolution that made the money that fed the industrial revolution from the end of the 18th century. So, significance of minsters, wrong thing. Had the demand for surplus income. The important thing about the minsters was that they also had a class of men who were literate. If you were going to have intensifying agricultural production, you wanted to make a lot of money, you had to be able to track where the money was coming from. You had to track where the labor was coming from. You had to track where the input for the seed corn was going to be coming from. You had to track renders coming in from your outer states. You had to track stuff that was going out for trade. You had to have track that was going out to secondary production, to the mills, to the cloth weavers, to the meat producers. You had to do all of that. And in effect, what you had to do was create a really complex system of accounting. And that was what the minsters have. And one of the things that one finds all over these high status ecclesiastical sites is styli. They were writing, they were making accounts. These were people who were literate, who were familiar with classical sources, who were well able to develop accounting practices. So what actually did they do? Mark has covered a lot of them. They put their estate centres close to intersections between roads and rivers, as John Blair's work. They expanded agricultural production. It's in this period that you see the the area of fields beginning to grow. They introduced new crops, better crops for threshing. Debbie has worked on that. So you more, in a sense, a crop that was more efficient for utilization. They improved fertility with green manures, and also by creating hay meadows like the one at Yarnton, where you fed the hay to the animals, and what came out the other end in the winter went back on your fields. It may not have been terribly successful as a strategy. The fertility fields may have declined over time, but they were trying to make it work. And then, of course, there was the investment in the heavy plough. And while the Limminge coulter is the only intact coulter that we have from this period, there are a number of other finds of coulters, also from high status sites, which add to the burden of proof. So the estates put everything into expanding arable production, and at the same time they were building mills. Think of all the 8th century mills that have been found across England over the last 20 years. They were, I lost my thread. They're building mills. They were doing wool textile production. You can see that at Brandon, they had a separate section of the village there, which was for dyeing and producing cloth. They were, you can't say manufacturing meat, but they were focusing on animal production. There are places like Wick and Bonhunt, which was about pork. Out on the fens, it was about beef. Other places, it was about sheep. And then there's salt. So there's all kinds of secondary production that was going on as part of a renaissance of economic development. The thing is, you can say that about all these things. You can say, well, that's what the ministers were doing, and there are lots of extensive estates, and they're all literate and all that stuff. But that doesn't explain why the central province, because obviously, if you look on the right-hand side, all those red dots are on ministers before 900, taken from John Blair's book, and you can see that there are quite a lot in the central province. There are plenty outside. The answer, I think, lies in two characteristics of the central province noted by Delahook and by others. And that is the slide on the left-hand side. So if you look at the central province here, there it comes down here, you can see that this is an area in which there was very little early medieval woodland. So Delahook suggests that woodland, that those are areas of long-term arable, long history of arable production. And then it also shows, sorry, I should say this is from Stuart and Brian's book, it also shows little black dots, Romanized buildings. And Della and others have suggested that these are places in which there was a long history of servile labor, unfree or semi-free labor. So maybe that's something special about the central province, but it's still not quite enough. So what was so special about it? It's got these long-term traditions, we've got medium-term change, and the one thing we haven't talked about is the Mercian hegemony. There's Mercia, boundary of. There is the central province running down through it, and you can see a large number of minsters within that area. So what I'm suggesting is that there are these long-term traditions of cultivation in those areas where minsters were founded, in places where there was a long-term tradition of arable cultivation, was already a dependent population. Their arable was expanded, and it was expanded initially on the inlands with the unfree, and then later, once the inlands were insufficient or completely producing as much as they possibly could, they went on to lease out land to dependent tenants. And that again is from, you can see it in Ina's law. He makes a distinction between the inlands and what he calls the Gazette lands. So a lot of debate about the Gazette lands, but fundamentally it seems to be people who gave up their rights to move away from an area and provided labour services for the estates in return for some form of security on the estate. And I think that is where we should be looking for the beginnings of open field, because Mercia was part of a European-wide renaissance, which was led by the kings and the churches of Francia in particular and Mercia. The connection between the two was key. Charlemagne was in touch with others in England, but it was his relationship with Mercia which formed his relationships with the others. And what did Offa do? He built burhs with new markets. He got his relations running, his extensive estates, to defend those new markets with the new, what are called the three common burdens. He introduced a new coinage, which was reliable across his kingdom. He established a hierarchy of trading places from emporia right the way down to towns, and then into the estates themselves, and then into little local markets. What you have in Mercia over the long 8th century is the development of a stable political and economic structure which enables the extensive estates to produce their surplus and to trade it and make loads of money. So, what have we got? Why is this about the origins of open fields? It is because on those dependent tenant estates, those newly leased estates, there's a clash of values. On the one hand, there's the top-down of the lords saying, I want it to be like this. Evidence from other parts of Europe, not from Britain, unfortunately, but we do have it from Ireland and from France, that they divided their arable into fields, that each field was subdivided into strips, that the crops were directed by the lords, but it was the tenants who organised how it happened in practice. And that is a clash, or a negotiated solution, you might say, to two competing values. One value is that I'm the lord, you're going to do as I say. The other value is, excusez-moi, we've been collectively governing ourselves and doing perfectly well without any top-down for centuries. Would you just get back in your box? So what you've got is this, a solution which allows both. The lord says, I want lots of this crop in my barns next autumn. The tenants say, okay, that's fine, we'll go away and we'll organise it, but we'll organise it in the way to which we're accustomed. But these aren't regarded, are not any more than the ancestors of wide open field systems. You can't actually say you can see the Midland system until the 12th century, because as Chris and Joan Thirsk both remarked, the only way that we know that Midland field systems existed, where they existed, is because we have documentary evidence for them. And until we have documentary evidence for them, we can't say they were there. We have to go with the lowest common denominator, which is a narrow open field system. And that's my book, which is a lot better, a lot more articulate, and lots more examples than I've been able to give you today. Chapter and verse.